And we'll still wait another minute or two. Yeah.
Well, we've got a good representation of our Hamula here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people also, especially after 3 days, they're like, oh, I'm burnt out, but I'll watch the recording another time. So, so that's why we just want to make sure that we record it.
We are a good enough audience already, so it's
Yeah, hey.
Yeah, and I have to say, I started with the first session of this AIS conference, and I'm ending with the last one, so it has extended.
Yeah.
So, but it is nice to be able to go watch some things that you haven't had a chance to see, if it's something's in a different panel or something like that. That is nice.
When will the recordings appear?
You know, that's a good question, and I'm not 100% sure. So we'll send out a message on the AIS listserv or to the registrants for the conference. Okay. Well, I think I'll start with the introductions, even though there'll be a couple people who might still, you know, come on, so that, you know, we won't have to rush too much, and we'll have time for questions. Okay. So, righty. So I'm happy to welcome you to this mini plenary, which constitutes highlights from most of the contributors to the recently released book, Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond. So this is the book, edited by Ilan Peleg, Saliba Sarsar, and myself. I'm Yael Aronoff. Saliba, Yossi, Nadav, and I explore aspects of trust, identity, and memory, denationalization, and the two-state solution as they impact resolutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Naomi Chazan, Ilan Peleg, and Joel Migdal address challenges to democracy in Israel, in other divided societies, and in the creation of the American public. And Yael Zerubavel analyzes biblical and national narratives and memory. Mike Aronoff will be the respondent, and in the book, he also writes the epilogue in response to the chapters. So I want to thank my fellow co-editors, Ilan Peleg and Saliba Sarsar, and again, contributors Nadav Shelef, Yossi Beilin, Naomi Khazan, Joel Migdal, Yael Zerubavel for their tribute to my dad, Mike Aronoff, in honor of his great contributions to the comparative study of political culture as applied to Israel. His work and mentorship has had a great influence on many scholars and students, and we've all been influenced by his work in many ways. We're living in a time of constant and often dramatic change in political cultures, as well as some continuities shaped by conflict, internal and external divisions, and challenges to democracy. Mike Aronoff's important work on the interplay between politics and culture, and his role in building important conceptual and methodological bridges between anthropology and political science help us to better understand how political culture in Israel and beyond is complex and complicated, and as he states, contested, contingent, and highly contextual. So I'm going to just quickly introduce all the speakers, and then we'll each try to limit ourselves to 8 minutes so that we can open it up for questions from the audience afterwards. So a quick introduction to my dad, Mike Aronoff, is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science, Anthropology, and Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. His PhD from anthropology is from Manchester University, and his PhD in political sciences from UCLA. And he devoted, I'll mention some of the books that he's written, Frontier Town, The Politics of Community Building in Israel, Power and Ritual in the Israeli Labor Party, Israeli Visions and Divisions, Cultural Change and Political Conflict. And he's also co-authored Anthropology and Political Science, A Convergent Approach, and edited Freedom and Constraint, a memorial tribute to Max Gluckman, and the series of Political Anthropology. He was awarded the first Lifetime Achievement Award at the Association of Israel Studies, and was its founding and first president. Saliba Sarsar is professor of political science at Monmouth University. His most recent authored books are Peace Building and Israeli-Palestinian Relations and Jerusalem, The Home in Our Hearts. His most recent edited book is What Jerusalem Means to Us, Christian Perspectives and Reflections. Actually, that's his not most recent book. I think he's done at least two books since. He's been the guest editor of a special issue of I can't keep up with everyone's publications, Journal of South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, focusing on Israel-Palestine and the prospects for peace. And he's the recipient of multiple awards, including the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Global Visionary Award, and the Safford Presidential Award of Excellence from Monmouth University, and the Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice, as well as the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation Award. Yossi Beilin is the head of the steering committee of the Geneva Initiative, and in the context of Israeli-Palestinian relations, he initiated the Oslo process in 1992, the Beilin-Abu Mazen Agreement from 1993 to 95, and the Geneva Initiative in 2001 and 2003. Beilin was Israeli Justice Minister and served as Deputy Minister and Minister in 4 governments in Israel between 1988 and 2001. He was elected to the Knesset in 1988 and resigned 20 years later. And for many years, he represented the Labour Party. In 2003, he moved to the Meretz Party and was its leader between 2004 and 2008. Nadav, he was also, as my dad is proud to say, a PhD student with my dad. So Nadav Shelef is the Harvey M. Meyerhoff Professor of Israel Studies and Professor of Political Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. His most recent books include Homelands, Shifting Borders and Territorial Disputes, and Evolving Nationalism, Homeland Identity and Religion in Israel, 1925 to 2005. As with many of the people here, I've assigned their books in my classes, including Nadav's Homelands book. Naomi Khazan is Professor of Emeritus of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and currently serves as a Senior Research Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and at the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace. She is former member of the Knesset from 1992 to 2003, past president of the New Israel Fund from 2008 to 2012, and has been active in a variety of human rights, peace, and women's organizations for over 4 decades. She's written and edited 9 books and over 70 scholarly articles. Ilan Peleg is Charles Dana Professor of Government Law at Lafayette College and is author or editor of 11 books and over 90 scholarly essays. Among Peleg's books are Democratizing the Hegemonic State, Israel's Palestinians, The Conflict Within, The Victimhood Discourse in Contemporary Israel. He's former president of the Association of Israel Studies and the founding editor-in-chief of Israel Studies Forum, the scholarly journal of the Association of Israel Studies. We have 2 more participants. Joel Migdal is the Robert Phillip Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington Henry Jackson School of International Studies, emeritus as well. He was the founding chair of the University of Washington's International Studies program and formerly Associate Professor of Government at Harvard and Senior Lecturer at Tel Aviv University. Among his many books are Strong Societies and Weak States, The Palestinian People, A History, Shifting Sands, the United States and the Middle East, Through the Lens of Israel. And he's also past president of the AIS. For those of you who are listening, if you weren't at the panel in tribute to him, I think it was on Monday, you can go back and see the recording for that. Yael Zerubavel is Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University and the former founding director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. She has published extensively in the areas of collective memory and identity, political myths, Israeli culture, war and trauma, and symbolic landscapes. She is the author of the award-winning Recovered Roots, Collective Memory, and the Making of Israeli National Tradition, and most recently, Desert in the Promised Land. She is the recipient of the AIS Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. So, and I'm humbled in front of all these bios. I don't have a bio anywhere near those, but I'm the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel and chair in Israel Studies at Michigan State University. And yesterday finished being president of the Association of Israel Studies. So Ariana, before we get started with the content in terms of our presentations, I don't know, I saw a few people do this in the panel and I thought, oh, I'll do this as well. I'll put a plug in for the book. So this is the flyer for the book. I think there's a 30% discount. And if you move down, Ariana will put in the chat the link that you can go to if you want to order the book with the 30% discount. Actually, this, I think it still exists. Or if you want to have your library order a hard copy, those of you working in universities, or an online copy. Okay, we'll take that down. Thank you so much, Ariana. Okay. So I'll start with my presentation, and let me write down my time and try to keep time for myself, because I know it's hard for all of us to keep to 8 minutes. So I'm going to be talking about the pathways to peace legitimization of a two-state solution. So the paradigm for a Jewish majority state and an Arab Palestinian majority state existing alongside each other has been existed as long as the conflict itself. And the Oslo Accords that Beilin initiated made this solution, I think, the default accepted one for the mainstream of both parties to the conflict. And since then, it's been the main paradigm for solving the conflict, with its legitimacy derived from both popular support on the ground and from international actors. The majority of Israelis have supported this paradigm for the past 25 years with bigger or less majorities, and the majority of Palestinians have accepted it in certain crucial periods. It's been the basis of a series of serious peace negotiations that made tremendous progress in narrowing the gaps among the two nationalist movements, and is met with increasing international and regional support over time. So even though this two-state solution was never hegemonic and was always contested, it has derived significantly greater support and backing than any other alternative. Of course, there have been recent significant challenges, which include the stagnation of the peace process, decreased public support among Israelis and Palestinians, an emboldened political right in Israel challenging the paradigm, decreased internal legitimacy of the PA, the PLO, and Hamas, Hamas control of Gaza, increased settlement in the West Bank, the Trump administration's complete one-sided approach to the conflict, culminating in the Trump peace plan that excluded the Palestinians entirely and was a significant departure from the Clinton parameters, as well as decreased prioritization of the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for regional and international actors due to the turmoil in the region and their perceived more urgent internal and external threats. Despite these many challenges, the legitimacy of this two-state solution is still greater than the legitimacy of any other single paradigm. When taking a broader view compared, if you look at 30 years ago, 20 years ago, the two-state solution has still grown in legitimacy. The two-state solution remains almost hegemonic in the international community. And public support among Israelis and Palestinians is still relatively higher than for the one-state solution and shows still a plurality of support. So the decrease in support, by the way, among the populations is often rooted in a lack of faith that the other side supports it, as opposed to necessarily a rejection of the paradigm itself. Significant portions of the Israeli right have in some respects shifted to the center, and more parties factions support two states than they did 20 years ago. There is no other paradigm that is seriously discussed as an alternative by significant numbers of Israelis and Palestinians. So while the phrase one-state solution is more common now, visions of what that one state might look like differ wildly between parties, even more so than do visions of a two-state solution. A basic common understanding of what the two-state solution would look like has emerged over 2 decades of serious peace negotiations, including most importantly, the Clinton parameters. In contrast, there's no such corresponding set of cooperative negotiations or plans for a one-state solution. So in terms of assessing legitimacy, I want to go back to Mike Aronoff's work, because he's contributed to the conceptualization of legitimacy and to the application of those concepts to political culture that bridges political science and anthropology. He has analyzed how political parties have attained, retained, and ultimately lost legitimacy, how governments use ritual and symbols to challenge this legitimacy, and how varied political cultures contest the legitimacy of the identity of the state. Aronoff discusses how the conscious acceptance of legitimating discourses is vital to legitimacy, but does not necessitate complete consensus. And while Aronoff examines how the myths of legitimacy and social establishment validate the established order, clarify legality and community, and transform power into authority into the context of domestic politics, here I extend that examination to the legitimacy of potential solutions to international conflict. That is, the way the myths regarding particular paths to resolving conflict can serve similar purposes, providing validation to international, regional, and domestic engagement and negotiation based on these paradigms. I also build on Mike Aronoff's work on the varied perceptions of the Camp David peace negotiations in 2000, with varied perceptions of what happened there and its perceived failure, despite the real progress that was also made there. So I look at kind of the rhetoric of international organizations that kind of reinforce the norms for self-determination on which the two-state solution is based. And I also look at the public opinion of Israelis and Palestinians. And as Shamir and Chikaki argue, leaders and their policies may turn favorable sentiment expressed privately into collective readiness to implement a plan. And they claim that perceptions of majority opinion, in addition to polls of individual preferences, bolster this legitimacy. So when we look at challenges to this legitimacy, we do see a decline in support for a two-state solution. So while it overall has gone up, so in 1986, only 20% of Jewish Israelis supported it, whereas in 2006, it was up to 60%. And in 2006, 73 and 76% of Israelis and Palestinians supported negotiations as opposed to unilateral moves. So again, over 25 years, you see a general increase. You do see a relative decline more recently. So, so it went down to 58% of Israelis supporting two-state in 2018 and 2019. And Palestinian support for two-state stood at 51% in 2016 and then fell dramatically to 40% after the Trump peace plan. So nevertheless, when asked which of the following do you prefer as a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in December 2020, 48.7% Palestinians say they prefer a two-state solution, while only 9.3% say one state, and 10.6% say confederation. So it's still, relatively speaking, still much more significant, even after so many years of disillusionment, stagnation of the peace process, and the Trump administration. In February 2020, 85% of Palestinians surveyed believed that there was also corruption in the PA and 65% in Gaza. And this also contributes kind of their dissatisfaction with Fatah and the other parties. They link that as well with dissatisfaction or with the two-state solution. Of course, the rhetoric of Netanyahu did great damage, as well as his actions, supporting more settlements, building more settlements, supporting unilateral annexation. The fact that Bennett might be the next prime minister, although the coalition is preferable to what have been under Netanyahu, certainly may undercut as well, to some degree, legitimacy for two states, since he supports one state. And certainly Trump did a tremendous amount of damage to the legitimacy of the two-state solution. And I won't have time to go into details for that. But I think a lot of us know about that. But I think that a lot more damage would have been done had he been reelected. And now that Biden is president, he's kind of restoring that legitimacy. And there was also a huge backlash to Trump on the part of the UN, the EU, and lots of other international actors, Congress itself, reinforcing kind of the two-state paradigm. So, so again, I don't have time to get into it now, I see, but I have, if you have time to read to the chapter, lots of public opinion polls showing that through different questions, through different years, that the relative support for two states remains significantly higher than for any other solution. And there's also kind of interesting polls that suggest, for instance, that Palestinians care more about establishing a state than they do necessarily implementing right of return, even though they care about both. But the relative prioritization of different issue areas gives hope for accommodation as well that would need to happen in a two-state solution. There's also kind of interesting data about Israeli parties and how many of what percentage of those parties supports two states. So for instance, in January 2020, unsurprisingly, maybe almost 70% of Labor, Gesher Meretz supporters and Blue-White Party supporters support the two-state solution. perhaps more surprisingly, 51% of Israel Beitenu voters, 44% of Joint List voters, 33% of United Torah Judaism voters, 33% Likud, a quarter of New Right voters, and a quarter of Shas voters. So if you look at this incredible coalition we might see with 8 parties, several of those parties, even on the right, between a fourth and a half of those parties support the two-state solution, which gives perhaps some wiggle room to leave some space open to maximize perhaps the Abraham Accords, perhaps agreements with Saudi Arabia that might allow for freezes of settlements in most of the West Bank in exchange for some level of normalization, whether it be economic, trade, or other things. So I don't have time to go into kind of why the one-state solution in this, which I do in the chapter, has significantly less legitimacy than the two states, but I can also answer questions when it comes to that. And also I was looking at, because nothing is linear, whether there'd be some kind of triggers or trends that might reinforce kind of a path to two states, or actually weaken it and possibly undermine it completely. And two of the triggers that one would look at perhaps is whether the Palestinian Authority maintains security cooperation with Israel, and whether the Palestinian Authority would collapse. And of course, we did unfortunately see in May 2020 that Mahmoud Abbas cut off, to some extent, the security cooperation with Israel, but that only lasted a few months. He never dismantled the security forces. He continued support for two-state solution. And within months, he had reinstated it before even Biden was inaugurated to be president. So certainly it's the case, and if we look at the past month and the violence of the past month, that there could be continued disillusionment with lack of progress that could eventually, seriously undermine support and legitimacy for this, which would then in turn undermine international support for the two-state solution. So there's certainly no guarantee that we'll see a linear path that towards increasing legitimacy. Nevertheless, there is some hope, even with this new government and with the Biden government, and even with Bennett, who is farther right than Netanyahu, to offer some measures that would keep this door open and perhaps open it further under Lapid, of course, with real qualifications as to the significance of change that could be made under this new coalition government. So I'll stop there. And I think next is Saliba, if you could move us further. And sorry, I went a little bit over, so I have to be generous with everyone as well. So.
Thank you, Yael, very much. Truly enjoyed listening to your presentation. It's very much important at these days, as you all have been very pained by the recent conflict, and this is like a deja vu over and over again. So let's hope for better days. My presentation in a way relates to this by focusing on the interconnections between memory and identity in Israeli-Palestinian relations. My objective is to understand how the two traumas of the Holocaust and the Nakba influence Israeli Jews and Palestinians respectively, and how they think, behave, and relate to each other. What are memories? What is identity? What is collective identity? Memories, our own and those we share with others, are forced by history and are essential for our identity. We can be confined by memory or gain much insight from it. When confined, we view history as a burden. When liberated, our knowledge of the past usually has a redemptive quality to it, which can be creative and empowering. Identity is the life blood of belonging, of social existence. Collective identity brings people together, which is based on their connective tissues of land, history, culture, religion, common values, and mutual sentiments, among others. To bolster collective identity and cohesion, and to ensure proper remembrance of traumas and triumphs, we extend ourselves, developing the common symbols of a national anthem, a national flag, creating national heroes, traditions, museums, and engaging in rituals as in celebrations and commemorations. However, parties in conflict have a tendency to marginalize or even purge the other's identity and memory from their own memory and psyche. They rush to beautify their face while disfiguring that of the other. Obviously, there is a real need to change our individual and collective identity, and this necessitates, as the late Dan Bar-On argued, internal processes of dialogue on each side, and these reinforce the external dialogues between the parties in conflict. There is also the urge to promote reconciliation, normally requiring expressions of security or peace, new relationships, regard for the other, truth, justice, mercy, and forgiveness. Participating in dialogue and reconciliation can serve as positive, albeit painful, means of reconstructing memory in the service of understanding and individual and social justice. The Holocaust, or Shoah in Hebrew, is the systematic persecution and mass murder of 6 million Jews and countless others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. And Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, marks the devastation that befell the Palestinian community as the result of the events surrounding the 1948 war between the newly created state of Israel on one hand and the surrounding Arab countries and the Palestinians on the other. Let me state right now that there is no qualitative or quantitative equivalence between these two traumas. Both differ in nature and in degree, as Bashir and Amos Goldberg hold, and many others do the same. However, each of these traumas provides a crucial reference and a vital narrative for its national community and for others. The Holocaust, as Julia Chaitin states, has generated in Jewish Israelis a continued fear of annihilation, which in turn directly connects it to the Palestinian-Israeli Arab-Jewish conflict. For the Palestinians, Nakba, in the words of Ahmad Saadi, has come to symbolize the loss of the homeland, the disintegration of society, the frustration of national aspirations, and the beginning of a hasty process of destruction of their culture. Most Israeli Jews commemorate the Holocaust on their own and do not acknowledge a Nakba or empathize with its victims. Many Palestinians are caught between denial of the Holocaust and little to no knowledge about it. One reason pertains to their struggle against Zionism and Israel, which color how the Holocaust is viewed. For the Palestinians, accepting Jewish pain around the Holocaust means accepting the moral ground for the creation of the state of Israel. For the Israeli Jews, accepting the pain of the 1948 Palestinian refugees means sharing responsibility for their plight and the right of return. In reaching out to understand the others' narratives, individuals and groups have faced a variety of reactions based on context, timing, message, among others. First, let me share with you the example of Father Emil Shofani, who is an Israeli Arab Christian theologian, educator, and activist for peace. His grandfather and uncle were killed by the Israeli army during the 48 war. In May 2003, he led 300 Israeli Arabs and Jews on a multi-faith pilgrimage to the historic city and district of Krakow and the Auschwitz-Birkenau Nazi death camps in Poland, where over 100 million Jews were murdered. There he told the group, "We are here to be with you, the Jewish people, in all its history and in all its suffering. From the suffering of our people today, we unite with your suffering." Father Shofani won UNESCO Prize for Peace Education in 2003. In 2014, Shofani was given the annual award of the French Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne for advancing Christian Jewish and Christian Muslim understanding. This example contrasts so much with a second example of Professor Muhammad Dajjani Dawudi, founder of the Wasatiyya movement of moderate Islam. He was head of the American Studies Department and director of the library at Al-Quds University. In March 2014, he organized a trip to Auschwitz for his students with the objective of learning more about the Holocaust and teaching tolerance and empathy. He was denounced as a traitor and collaborator. His car was torched and he lost his job at the university. For Dajjani Dawudi, Holocaust denial and distortion are morally unacceptable, historically incorrect, factually wrong, and constitute a major threat to ethics and human dignity, as well as the prospect of reconciliation and peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Group peace-building efforts are also reshaping memory and identity. They are advancing peace as well in terms of the calls for and work on behalf of civic equality, coexistence, mutual respect, tolerance, shared society, and social justice. They are learning to value in themselves and the other what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls the dignity of difference, and what I call also the goodness of similarity. Zochrot, for instance, Hebrew for remembering, Dhakirat in Arabic, promotes acknowledgement and accountability for the ongoing injustice of the Nakba and the reconceptualization of the return as the imperative redress of the Nakba and a chance for a better life for the country's inhabitants. Under the guidance of Prime, which was more active 10 or so years ago, a group of Israeli and Palestinian teachers developed a dual narrative of Israeli-Palestinian history. In a book called Side by Side, they have both separate narratives set literally side by side so that readers and students can track each other against the other, noting both where they differ as well where they correspond. All of you are aware of also the Parent Circle Families Forum, which is a grassroots organization of Israeli Jewish Palestinian families that have lost immediate family members due to the conflict, or also has its parallel narrative projects that brings different groups of Israelis and Palestinians together to learn about the personal and national narratives of the other. Now, I'm just concluding here. The record is more mixed at the national or governmental level, and it raises concerns. In Palestine, there is a strong anti-normalization campaign with Israel. And in Israel, there is a nation-state law that excludes Palestinian citizens of Israel from the national identity and demotes Arabic from its status as an official language, just as an example. Now, recently, statistics have shown that 90% of Palestinians do not trust Israeli Jews, and 79% of Israeli Jews do not trust Palestinians. Neither side believes it has a partner for peace. I think those numbers are exaggerated, but nevertheless, in conclusion, what I argue is that while there is a strong tendency to cling to memories and identities, or to turn memories and identities into weapons for victory over the other, there is a fervent call for common ground for accepting limits. Through empathy and generosity of spirit, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians can acknowledge each other's trauma in a multidimensional way, which will enable them ultimately to recognize the face, identity, and story of the other in their hearts and minds and seek true peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saliba, for always being an inspiration. I think Nadav is next.
Thank you. So it's my sort of honor to try and take some of the lessons that I at least take from Mike and see what we can do with them to try and understand what's going on here. And I think the place where at least I do it is to build on Mike's work first, that recognizes that these otherwise ephemeral things like culture and ideology matter, and they shape what actors do in the material world, and that they're not static, and that they can change over time. And I think taking those things seriously, right, leads us to ought to force us to think about the constellations under which current cultures and current ideas in Israel and Palestine might change or might not change, right, in ways that shape the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. And in my contribution to this volume, I try and do that through thinking through what it might look like to have Israelis and Palestinians change the guiding way in which they identify themselves. And what would it take for Israelis and Palestinians to what I call in this chapter denationalize, right? And what that might look like. And I'd like to suggest that there are at least conceptually 3 ways in which such denationalization can take place. And so one is where one or both of the groups substitute a different national identity for their current identity. So we could think of Gaddafi's vision of Israeltine as the alternative here, where we don't have Israelis and Palestinians anymore, we have Israeltinians, right? These kinds of substitutions happen quite commonly in lights of either in secessionist conflicts, where you have a secessionist group substituting Catalan nationalism for their Spanish nationalisms, or in integrative kind of nationalisms for those replaced. We might think of denationalization as replacing the current dominant foci of identification with non-national ones. These could be global citizens, for those so inclined, or more likely in this case, religious identifications that don't necessarily carry a nationalist connotation or requirement for sovereignty. And finally, it's possible that denationalization takes place where groups effectively re-ethnicizes, right? And sort of drops the imperative, the nationalist imperative for self-determination from its list of goals. And so becomes willing to live as an ethnic group inside a multi-ethnic state of one kind or another. And I try and think through in this chapter how likely each of these is to happen in the current constellation of circumstances, sort of both institutional and political. And the short story is, while these are available in theory, each of them seems hard to imagine, at least as things currently stands. Who knows what might happen in the future. So when it comes to denationalization by substitution, it's hard to imagine either Zionists or Palestinian nationalists deciding to replace their current identification with a new one. It's a particularly sort of hard ask, right, of these believers. And indeed, there's almost no support among Israelis currently for this position. And as Yael pointed out, even among Palestinians, there's relatively little support for abandoning the idea that Palestinians deserve a state of their own. It could happen, and it could happen if we have, and one can imagine an alliance between secular post-Zionist Jews, the non-Zionist Haredim, and citizen Palestinians that could come together to do that. That's conceivable. It's in fact potentially more conceivable now than it was just a few months ago, given the greater, at least open integration of parties representing citizen Palestinians in what looks like the forthcoming Israeli government. But in my view, this kind of political alliance is going to be very, very hard to sustain. I'm going to go a little bit in the chapter about why that is quite difficult. Denationalization by replacement, I think, is also possible. If you have politically quiescent religious groups on both sides, both among Israelis and among both among Jewish Israelis and among Palestinians. But for the most part, these tend to lose out, at least historically, have to lose out to the nationalists, right? So Israel tried to support this quiescent political group among Palestinians, but in the argument that set off within the religiously mobilized Palestinian community, the nationalists won. And so you have Hamas emerging to replace the politically quiescent thing. even among Jews, a significant proportion of the Haredim, almost half, a little bit more than half, consider themselves to be Zionist, right? And this does not count the Chardal, right? And so these groups, it's hard to imagine the non-nationalist version of those identifications becoming so dominant that they become to take over the political spectrum. And then finally, denationalization by downshifting, that is by replacing the goal of self-determination with the goal of sort of ethnic rights within a multi-ethnic state does happen. But if you start looking around the world for other cases or other contexts in which that kind of downshifting might happen, it turns out to be quite rare. Not only quite rare to happen, but rare to happen and stay permanent. This is some sort of fluctuation in that. And almost never to happen where a nationalist movement first succeeds and then gives up that power, right? So one have to think about the constellation under which Jewish Israelis have a state, a national state, and then choose to give it up. To do that, I think now it's not impossible, but perhaps one of the biggest obstacles to that happening is that such a constellation would need to first have real equality among Jews and non-Jews in Israel in order to drain both national stories out of their appeal to the general population. And this is very, very hard to do, right? Lots of states that have multiple ethnic groups that try to eliminate inequality among them. Let's say Britain, for example, tried to eliminate inequality between the English and the Scottish for 400 years and have failed, right? Despite being a very wealthy and until 1997 unitary state. And so I think that even this is one of the reasons why nationalist movements that downshift their goals for a while often come back and assert a desire for sovereignty down the road. So all of this is to say that I think when we're evaluating different potential alternatives or different ideas about constellations of what is possible or impossible now, right? It's worth paying attention to the mechanisms through which these kinds of political identifications can change over time, and the obstacles to that happening. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you for that groundbreaking theoretical conceptualization of alternatives. And I think Yossi Beilin, you're next.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with friends and teachers and the people who I read the articles. And my very humble contribution to the book deals with the issue of trust in negotiating peace or in international relations. The problem here is that usually we take trust as a sine qua non in negotiations. That we say that if we don't have trust, we cannot really negotiate. And I'm afraid that what we are doing by saying so is something like the fallacy of taking a reality, one reality, and using it in another context. Because trust is actually many things. And we usually compare it to buying and selling cars. So trust between the buyer and the seller of cars is that you believe that the one who is selling his car to you, second hand, of course, is not deceiving you and is not telling you that there were no accidents while there were some, or something like that. You say, okay, this guy makes a good impression, I trust him, he is not cheating. But this is not the case with negotiations, mainly because what is happening in negotiations is that you negotiate with another side. The negotiators in many cases are not the decision makers themselves. So they have to report to the decision makers on their sides. And then the decision makers have to convince the public opinion or the parliament or other bodies. So what is happening is that trusting the other side around the table is not like trusting the ability of the other side to fulfill the promises and the commitments which are exchanged during the negotiations. And I think that sometimes, because of the vagueness of the meaning of trust, trusting the negotiators is interpreted as trusting the other side's ability to deliver. And it happened to us, I believe, in the Oslo negotiations. And I'm referring in my chapter to something which is very specific. And this is the very important issue of the continuation of settlements. Because during the negotiations, first of all, there was trust. It didn't take much in order to have trust because we were not two parties which didn't want to make peace and were pushed to it by a third party or something like that. We wanted very much to make peace. We were the peaceniks on both sides. And we easily came to understand each other and to create a common denominator. So this was not the problem. When the Palestinians raised the issue of settlements and said, you know, okay, we are going to have a 5-year interim agreement, but in the meantime, we would like you to stop settlements. And personally, to our side, it was very reasonable. But back home, the Prime Minister Rabin said, please don't do it to me. I barely have a coalition. And you know what will happen if I declare now that as a result of negotiations with the Palestinians, I decide to freeze the settlements. And he pointed to the government resolution 360 of 92, which voluntarily referred to a freeze of settlements of public buildings or things like that. It was a limited but significant freeze on settlements. And he said, you can tell the Palestinians, I am committed to it. I don't want to build more settlements. I don't want to enlarge the settlements. Here is our decision. They should be aware of it. And it is very important for me not to have this article in our agreement. We came back to them, and because of this trust, I pursue, eventually they said yes, reluctantly you may say, or whatever, but it was not too difficult to convince the other side, the Palestinian side, not to mention it. And we, of course, were happy that they did not insist on it, because we were worried that Rabin would not be ready to accept such an article. Eventually, what happened is the wrong translation of what does it mean, trust in negotiations. Because we did not deceive the Palestinians. We wanted, I mean, personally, the people who were involved, and there were very few, were totally committed to end the settlements and did not see the settlements as something that Israel needed at all. The problem that was that we could not promise them that Rabin would not be assassinated, for example. We could not promise them that something like that actually said by Rabin trust us, we will not do it because I don't want to do it, is something that you can really use in court or wherever. And what happened, as you all know, is that there was another prime minister by the name of Netanyahu. And he did not like the Oslo agreement. At the beginning, he said, I will never implement it. Then before the elections, he changed his mind and said it more mildly. I'll do it my way. And he was his way, and I really believe, hope, and that he is on his way out. But his way was not to do it and to say, okay, if they fulfill their commitments, I will fulfill my commitments. And he was also the judge or the referee in that context. So what really happened was that when he was asked, Netanyahu was asked, why are you building more settlements or enlarged settlements? It is against the spirit of Oslo. So he said, show me the spirit in the agreement and I'll follow it. But there was no article saying it. And eventually, our so-called victory became the biggest defeat because the settlements remained the biggest obstacle on the way to peace. And since we insisted of not mentioning it, and the Palestinians agreed because of trust, we both paid a very high price for this event. And I think that what we have to learn from it is that trust is not always a sine qua non. And at least the ecological fallacy has to be reminded by the people. They have to understand it is important to know that your partner in the negotiations is honest, that he is not saying something like, this is my red line forever, there is no way, and then next morning he will change. No, he can trust them that they are not deceiving, which is important, but it is not the most important thing. And sometimes you have to insist, despite of this trust, on mentioning important things for you, because eventually you cannot trust the other side for fulfilling it if it is not very clearly mentioned. And this is, I believe, one of the sad lessons of our negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi, for that tragic lesson, although I still think the Oslo framework is alive and we admire all that you've done. So I think, Naomi, you're next.
Thank you, and hello to everybody, and it's good to see so many familiar faces. When I finished the absolute last draft of my article, which was about 1.5 years ago, I entitled it Israel's Democracy at a Crossroads. And I didn't realize that it was a preview to the real crossroads, which are taking place actually today. I think this week, literally this week, is probably one of the most significant weeks in Israel's political history, because by next Sunday night, Israel time, there will either be a new government, which will be a government that has only one major thing in common, and that is a total distrust of Benjamin Netanyahu, a distaste of his abuse of power, and a desire to replace him and his actions with some mode of a reinstatement of the rules of the game, or The other possibility is that it will finally collapse into a typically Israeli form of authoritarian populism. So we really are, as we're talking, at a crossroads. My article deals with the buildup to the situation that we're experiencing at the moment. And I deal with 5 major topics. I will not have the time. And at this time of night in Israel, I don't think I have the desire to go into great detail, but I do want to highlight some points because I think they demonstrate some of the very knotty issues, some of which have already been discussed and others will be discussed by the speakers that follow me. The first aspect of what I talk about is the very precarious and frail roots of Israel's democracy. The truth of the matter is that Israel's democracy was never very liberal. And the key period of liberalization coincided with the entrenchment of occupation, which is by definition antithetical to democracy because Israel controls or influences the lives of Palestinians against their will. A point, by the way, very well made by Gad Arieli in his latest book. I very much advise reading that book. So depending on what your unit of analysis, you have liberalization in Israel proper occurring while Israel is clearly an occupying and therefore anti-democratic country. Building on these roots, I deal with the process and the manifestations, the second point, of the backsliding or erosion of Israeli democracy. I highlight 3 major elements very closely intertwined. The first element is the contraction of rights, political rights, civil rights, and collective rights, a process that has been taking place very clearly under the Netanyahu tenure during the past 12 years. The second element is the unraveling, to a large extent, of institutional checks and balances within the system. It's the establishment of neo-authoritarian structures through weakening the Knesset, the opposition, the guardrails, the watchdogs, primarily the judiciary, the media, civil society. It's a structural aspect. And the third element or manifestation of the erosion of Israeli democracy over this past decade and some has been in the normative sphere through a disregard, a gradual disregard of the rule of law, of the rules of the game, and therefore the breach of any boundaries, which is so essential to democratic governance. If you put these 3 elements together, Israel has been in a crisis of democracy clearly for the last 5 years, but this process has accelerated as Netanyahu was indicted and then put on trial. It's become very difficult during the period of COVID, and 4 rounds of election have made these manifestations very, very salient and blatant. The third element of what I discuss is how this came about. How was it done? How does this process occur? And many people think that it's inconsequential, it just happened, that there were forces from below, etc. But I show, by the way, that this is very much a systematic policy. It has been orchestrated from above, using and manipulating popular forces. It's heavily funded from above as well. If you look at recent demonstrations in Israel, it's very easy to see that developing. And the truth of the matter is, it's all been pointed at bringing about and cementing the hegemony of a mindset which is extremely ethnocentric, extremely Jewish, extremely exclusive, and anybody who does not agree or dissents from this worldview is considered to be illegitimate to the point of being traitors. We're talking first about Palestinian citizens of Israel as a collective. We're talking about the left, whatever that means. By the way, many people dubbed left today. Any leftist would find it rather difficult to recognize. And sometimes it even involves issues of gender and ethnicity within Israel. But very clearly, one has to look at this as not happenstance, but directed, guided from above with a very, very smart understanding of what a charismatic leader can do under the circumstances, especially when he can deliver economically. So that's the third element. The fourth element of my chapter deals with the explanations. And I really would love to go into that into more detail, but let me just point out that unquestionably, despite the historical, cultural, economic underpinnings of such processes elsewhere and in Israel, very clearly, the political explanations are the most compelling in my mind. This is a political phenomenon. Some people claim that democratic erosion in Israel is a means to securing complete control of the occupied territories. Some people claim that it is essentially the ultimate goal of those who deny a Palestinian state and are looking for Israeli sovereignty elsewhere. I state very clearly that in this process, part of the explanation is the deterioration in the robustness of state capacity in Israel. I think the Israeli state has been weakened tremendously, visibly in the last 5 years, and to the point where identification with the state is very, very precarious, if it exists at all, which leads us to the last part of the chapter, and that is, what are the options? I still think that today, the initial move, which seems more likely to happen this coming Sunday, that there will be a new government in office by the end of Sunday, is maybe the beginning of an attempt to restore certain basic elements of Israel's democratic being up to a point. But how that fares with a coalition that spans the far right to the left is a very intriguing question as well. Another possibility is that this kind of change will be a hiatus, a pause, before the return of populist forces, and will have alternation between populism and more democratic groups without dealing with the root causes of the deterioration as I described it. And the final possibility is Israel, like some countries, will move beyond what is known as the tipping point into a more permanent type of neo-authoritarian structure. So these options, which are detailed in the chapter, are very, very real today, which leaves me with a question which I'll pose, and if we have time, we can discuss. How can one begin to channel, navigate, and perhaps direct towards a more refreshing option rather than a constant ping pong or even deterioration? It is possible, but one has to be aware of where we're going. And to connect to the previous speakers, this last sentence, everybody that has claimed, I think quite correctly, that one cannot differentiate between issues of Israel-Palestine and what is taking place within Israel and within Palestine are absolutely correct. And it's the way this issue impinges on internal matters, which may be able to bring about some kind of resolution on the relationship between the two as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. We miss you and Yossi in the Knesset, and I always feel like you're a prophet.
I don't know about Yossi, but I don't miss the Knesset.
Well, I'm sure you both don't miss it. I'm saying we miss both of you in it. It probably was a little ambitious, by the way, to think we would be able to finish so many speakers by 5. So we probably end at 5:15 or so, if everyone can bear with us. And that might mean that no co-host can end for us to keep going. So no co-host can end it. I think, Ilan, you're next. But do try to keep to the time. I was a little over myself, but so my dad will have a chance to respond to. You're muted, Ilan. You're muted.
Okay. I'm honored and I'm delighted actually to be part of this panel honoring my teacher, Mike Aronoff. I first met Mike, I think it was in 1970, roughly 51 years ago. I was then a graduate student at Tel Aviv University, and Mike offered his course on Israeli politics, focusing on Mapai. Mike's approach to politics, I think, had 4 major characteristics which I very much liked. He emphasized the relevance of political decisions to people's life, going beyond merely theoretical models. His approach was always interdisciplinary, combining politics, anthropology, cultural studies, before it was actually called cultural studies. The course was very comparative in nature, and there was a very strong normative perspective offered in it. So when Yael, Aronoff, Saliba Sarsar, and I met roughly 3 years ago to discuss the festschrift for Mike's 80th birthday, I decided to try to write something that will basically emulate those characteristics that were so clearly in Mike's approach to politics. So my essay in this volume deals basically with majority-minority relationships in deeply divided societies that are nevertheless democratic societies, which is usually not an approach that deeply divided society literature deals with. And what I'm trying to do is to look at Israel as an ideal case study with really immediate global implications that I think Naomi actually sort of hinted to. Generally speaking, all deeply divided societies have, I think, to balance two kinds of forces. First of all, majorities' expectations for control, and second of all, the minorities' demands for equality. When the society has actually democratic pretensions, maybe even democratic structure, the balance is always precarious and volatile. In my opinion, this particular issue has been the single most important challenge, not to Israeli democracy, but to the quality of Israeli democracy. So I think that a few factors have impacted the quality of Israel's democracy negatively from the very beginning. First of all, the country was established after both civil war and regional war, auspicious beginning for anybody. Second of all, the founding fathers decided, very controversially, I would argue, to have no constitution, which is to me a license for abuse. Thirdly, most Israelis did not have any notion whatsoever of what we think today of Western liberal democracy. And this included not only Olim from Middle Eastern countries, but also East European socialists. Number four, the religious parties demanded and received control over all personal status issues of the citizens, a problematical and non-democratic arrangement that was adopted. So in effect, Israel adopted formally the Ottoman millet system, itself eliminated even in Turkey. And above all, I think the fundamental goals of Zionism, the absorption and settlement of millions of Jews, were not entirely compatible with dealing equally with the minority, both as individuals and certainly as a group. But I think that as a country developed, new voices argued for real changes in order to seriously improve Israel's democracy. The military government over the Arabs was withdrawn in 1966. Real political competition for power evolved. In other words, Mapai basically lost its monopoly over power. The Chief Justice, Aaron Barak, announced a constitutional revolution, claiming successfully, surprisingly, I think, the power of judicial review, a la the United States, and pushing for civil equality. And then, of course, two basic laws passed in 1992, and they established a foundational principle of equality of all Israeli citizens, and were mostly accepted as such. But these liberal progressive forces were more than balanced by other forces within the Israeli society. The right became the dominant political force in Israel after 1977, and its ideology of nationalism, that is majority rule over limited minority rights, was established as more or less a permanent condition of the Israeli society. The formula of Israel as Jewish and democratic was introduced and enshrined as a counterbalance to the claim of democratic equality, I would argue. A full-fledged Kulturkampf, cultural war, between Hamachane HaLeumi, the national camp, and liberal, democratic, and progressive forces emerged, and I think it is still raging today. The occupation and the never-ending Arab-Jewish conflict has served the right well. To my view, it stopped the liberalization drift in Israel. And finally, in this regard, this overall trend was reflected in the long-term rule of Benjamin Netanyahu and his ability, or the ability of his government, not him personally, to pass eventually in July 2018 basic law, Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, a very, very controversial piece of legislation. To fully understand the Israeli case, you must apply to it theoretical concepts. In scholarly terms, deeply divided societies can adopt one of two main strategies for managing their diversity in general and majority-minority relationships specifically. Strategy one is accommodation. Accommodation aims at including minorities within the power structure of the polity. Accommodation can be implemented through a variety of methods such as autonomy, federalism, consociationalism, power sharing, and so on and so forth. So you can look at Finland or Canada or many cases and can say these are deeply divided societies, but they have found a constitutional and other ways of bringing groups together. The second strategy is hegemony. Hegemony aims at excluding minorities, usually by the heavy hand of the state that might include massive land expropriation, demographic measures, cultural policies such as the dominance of the majority's language, religion, and even symbols. And you can look at many cases like Sri Lanka or Turkey and many others that have adopted hegemony. By definition, accommodation is significantly more democratic than hegemony. Moreover, it is more stable and normatively speaking, you can argue, more just. Post-1948, Israel has developed a hybrid democracy. On the one hand, Israel conducted free and fair elections and had an independent judiciary, active parliament, and free press, all characteristic of a modern democracy. On the other hand, Israeli Arabs lost control over most of their lands. Their parties were considered ineligible for coalition membership, and they have been discriminated against in numerous ways in employment, education, housing, and so on and so forth. While the Israeli regime never met the strictest demands of Western liberal democracy, complete equality of individuals, state neutrality towards social groups, and protection of democracy, of minorities, for example, the state has been much more sympathetic toward individual rights of minority members than toward group rights of the minorities. The Arab minority was not recognized as such for political purposes, although, we have to agree, education in Arabic and Islamic courts and so forth were accepted. For many years, I've been convinced that the policy of successive Israeli governments, not only right-wing governments, sometimes left-wing governments, towards the Arabs in Israel, was the ultimate, was ultimately unsustainable. Recent developments, and I'm going to finish with that, suggest that we may indeed be on the verge of long overdue transformation. Several weeks ago, there were large-scale and violent clashes, not only in East Jerusalem, but also in mixed cities inside Israel, Lod, Akko, Haifa, and so forth. The riots could be read as a warning to the politicians, to the political class in Israel, that discrimination breeds resentment, resentment breeds violence, and massive violence can destroy the already fragile Israeli democracy. Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the verge of losing power, began negotiations with at least one Arab Muslim party, Ra'am, violating in effect, and surprisingly so, the long existing taboo against the inclusion of Arabs in coalition governments. While Bibi might have acted out of political desperation rather than out of moral convictions that demanded a change, the important fact is that he and many others in the political system have come to realize that Arabs, over 20% of the electorates, are indeed a legitimate part of the Israeli political system. Traditionally a hybrid democracy, Israel since 2009, when Netanyahu returned to power, has seen the strengthening of its ethno-religious character. The coalition between Likud and the Haredim is not, has a reason, an ideological reasons for it. This process is accompanied by serious challenges in Israel to civil liberties, minority rights, the rule of law, as Naomi said, artistic and academic freedoms, and the free press. Like other countries, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, Brazil, and many others, Israeli democracy has been under assault. Yet, I will end by saying that the event of the last few weeks suggests that the future of Israeli democracy remains open. Thank you.
So thank you, Ilan, for your comparative work in this area and for leaving us some opening for hope, as Naomi tried to do in terms of one of the possibilities as well. We're next going to hear from Joel Migdal, then Yael Zerubavel, and then Mike Aronoff will respond. So I hope that many, if not all of you, can stay till 5:30, because I have a feeling we're going to be going to at least 5:15, 5:30. So Joel Migdal, you're next.
Thank you, Yael. And I just want to say it's a great pleasure to honor Mike Aronoff. He was a kind of mentor my first job at Tel Aviv in the session on Monday. He taught me to think about the micro, and its relationship to the macro, how ethnography and anthropology really inform much larger structures, and also how you often have to look to understand democracy, to understand the state. You have to often look far from the capital city in places like Frontier Town, that he wrote his book on, to understand how the state is lived and what its impact is. So my article in the book is less directly on Israel than the others. I'm interested in how diverse, complex societies like Israel, where people are packed together in cities and interact with people whom they do not know on a personal level, how they create this notion of a public. In such a public, people accord others that they consider to be part of that same public with respect, treat them as familiar, even when they're strangers, and deem them as safe and non-threatening. They walk down the street or in a public park or somewhere else and feel that these people, though they don't know them at all, can be lived with, if not trusted. Being part of the public then means able to move through society, through streets, through malls, through job interviews, through coffee houses, without regard to one's race or ethnicity or gender or class or any other associated characteristics. People that they deem to be outside the public, they treat with suspicion. They see them as dangerous, see them as people they don't want to be in the same space with, somehow not genuine parts of the society or the nation. So my article asks, who becomes part of the public? And who is left on the outside? And how and why does that change over time? And the anxiety underlying this question of who's in and who's out, and can people be trusted, and can you feel a sense of familiarity, can be seen so vividly in last month's clashes in the mixed cities in Israel. So the public, this notion of the public, in my understanding, is characterized by four qualities. First of all, everyday practices. Everyday practices which are guided by an implicit code of rules. How you behave on the playground, how parents interact with each other there, how you behave on the sidewalk, and so on. These rules, although often not articulated, are extremely important in gaining a sense of familiarity and security with others. Characteristic of publics is that they have social boundaries from those excluded, even within the same society. The third element that characterizes the public is a tension inherent in any public between the notion of equality, we're all part of this society, we're all part of this game, and status differences inside the boundaries of the public. And I'll come back to this in a bit. And the last, fourth element characterizing publics is the transcending of particular differences by members of the public to apply influence on government and leaders of social institutions regarding what the common welfare of the society is and should be. This notion of transcending your own interests for the common good, it seems to me, is critical, especially in what was mentioned earlier today in another session, the Republican notion of government. So the existence of public implies an intricate dance of daily behavior, how you behave on the playground, as well as a kind of collective deliberation about what the common good is. And that's extremely complex. The rules of daily behavior became particularly important in cities where people did not know each other personally. As soon as you have urbanization, you have the problem of security and familiarity with people you don't know at all. Now, repeated ways of behaving in volunteer organizations, the workplace, shops, downtown streets, social clubs, and so on, became more than habit. They became established, if unspoken, rules in which people actually cherish the way things are commonly done. And you can see this when you go into almost any public setting and someone behaves, quote unquote, inappropriately, that is, breaks the rules, they're indicated to be, or they're labeled as jerks or assholes or something of this sort. The rise of cities and capitalism provoked anxiety and tensions. In my paper in the volume, I focus on three cultural polarities in cities that deeply affected the creation of the public. I'm not going to go into them in any great time.
You're all of a sudden muted, Joel.
Myself. Okay. So I was started to say, oh, you can hear me now? Yeah. The rise of cities and capitalism tensions, and on paper, I look at three of these in particular. One is between intimacy and freedom. Cities are places of opportunity where one can make it, and at the same time, places of danger and vice and terrible things. They created fear of the outsider at the same time that they created this kind of magnet for getting to know the outsider as a form of opportunity. The second element is segmentation and integration, another tension. This is diverse groups interacting economically in defined spaces, which promotes integration. And at the same time, residential and other social segregation of different groups from each other that promotes segmentation. And finally, there's the tension of organic and contractual unity. Various groups have tried in every period of history to define special organic ties that link people to one another, religion, culture, language, nationhood, whatever it may be. At the same time, the rhetoric of liberalism presented a contending vision of the glue holding the nation together, the contractual perspective. So as we saw in the events in last month in the mixed cities of Israel, these cities can be cauldrons for unrest. They can tear the fabric of society apart, and they can tear apart the chances of building a public with a sense of the common good. And at the same time, the incorporation of Palestinian citizens of Israel into the coalition for the first time, the presence of Palestinian citizens in universities, malls, parks, drugstores, hospitals, as doctors, pharmacists, and just people seeking leisure. All these can send a separate signal, a signal about the possibilities for a public that can incorporate groups, not based on organic affinities, but on contractual ones.
Thanks for your comparative insights with both the United States and Israel, and also leaving us on a note of hope. Next we'll have Yael Zerubavel, and then a response by Mike Aronoff.
So nice to be here and to celebrate Mike and his many accomplishments in so many spheres. I met Mike for the first time in 1983, when as a young PhD myself, I presented a paper on the image of the wandering Israeli in Hebrew literature. And Mike was the first one to pose a question. And in fact, it was a comment. He liked the paper very much, but then he said, you also have to consider the mirror image of the American Jew who is wandering between Israel and the United States. So that was my introduction to Mike, and it really started a few decades of a dialogue, not always explicit, but definitely resonant in our work. Mike and I share an interest in collective memory and identity, and a broad interdisciplinary approach to our work, interweaving anthropological, historical, and political perspectives, and at time venturing into the study of literary text. And of course, I'm referring here not to my own work that deals with Hebrew literature, but Mike's expedition into the literary sphere, studying Le Carré. From 1996, when I joined Rutgers until Mike's retirement, we were also colleagues at Rutgers. Mike provided highly appreciated support to me during those years of hard work to build a new center for Jewish studies, a new program in Jewish studies, in which Israel played an important role, and to navigate the mysteries of Rutgers bureaucracy. One of the first tasks that we worked together, and I trust you remember it too, Mike, was the organization of the AIS annual conference at Rutgers, which was an enormous undertaking with just beginning to have staff, and Mike was really superb. I also, of course, was inspired by Mike's work in recovered roots. When I studied the making of Israeli national tradition and national myth, I was so interested in seeing the way that tradition is invented and constructed, but also spent a lot of time studying the contested narratives related to those myths, and Mike's work, especially of the Bar Kokhba, was a direct source for that. And in my later work in Desert in the Promised Land, I actually went back to Mike's earlier work on the frontier town, drawing on Arad, but in broader ways. The very study of mental or cognitive templates that shape the perception of the past and the perception of the present, and the ways the interplay between the desert as a symbolic landscape and the Yishuv has played out not only in terms of the history of the Yishuv and the desert, but also in terms of its perception, impact on the perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if I had wanted to be more part of the Chavura, or the group, in discussing the politics, I probably should have chosen to present the mental templates that I deal with: the desert, the island, and the wall, and the way they play in the they play into the Israeli side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I took my role as the culturalist in the group very seriously, and therefore decided to choose part of my newer work, my current work, on a book that I tentatively call Biblical Representations and the Performance of Antiquity in Israeli Culture. And what I'm looking then is the ways that the Bible has been not only a sacred text in the early years, which is something that is more greatly known or widely known, and a foundational text in Israeli culture, but the way that it has been reinterpreted and transformed from different perspectives and for different purposes outside of the formal study of the Bible. So I'm looking at things like the use of historical analogies, contested and divergent narratives, the conflation of time, and other mnemonic strategies in the interpretation of the Bible more generally, but through the analysis of particular texts. So here I would just briefly mention some of the things that I've done. The text that I chose for the first read was Meir Shalev, Tanakh Achshav, The Bible Now, which was published in 1985, drawing on his earlier column in Haaretz. At that particular juncture in Israeli political culture, Shalev's work was greeted as a turning point in Israeli culture, and it was hailed as the first serious secular commentary, midrash, by an Israeli writer. Although Zionist Hebrew culture elevated the national status of the Bible as a primary sacred text that legitimized the Zionist project and was an important cornerstone of modern Hebrew culture, by the mid-1980s, the status of the Bible suffered from a general decline. The widening gap between biblical and Israeli Hebrew made the Bible less accessible to the younger generation. Growing politicization of the Bible by the right's expansionist agenda, using it as a support of the settlement movement, led to alienation from the Bible in certain circles, of course, and growing secular religious tensions made secular Israel feel as if the Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, have the privileged position of interpreting the Bible and excludes them. Shelef, now that has changed, by the way, but that was a perception in 1985, not the position of the Orthodox and the Haredi, but the Shelef started a movement, and so by now is not perceived necessarily this way. Shelef directs his writing to secular Israelis to highlight the Bible's appeal and relevance. So you feel that he's trying to convince people why the Bible is actually important. It's not taken for granted. And he writes in his introduction, "My Bible is a different Bible. Its writers and characters are flesh and blood. It's not written by God, and its heroes are neither pure nor saintly. Have a scholar's education or a traditional commentator's motivation. For me, the Bible is an exciting and a thought-provoking book, which I love to read. It contains sufficient doses of politics, love, faith, and thought to make any reader reflect on what happens around him even today. This is the spirit in which I have written the book." Shelef relates to the Bible as a repository of collective memory and hence as a text that continues to offer a venue for a dialogue between the past and the present. In other words, the kind of a statement that we make about collective memory is what he applies to the Bible without calling it in these terms. As the title Tanakh Achshav, the Bible now, indicates, Shelef resorts to the literary strategy of contemporarization, taking past figures and events out of their historical period and applying to them contemporary views and sensibilities. Though he occasionally uses the opposite strategy of archaization, that means referring to contemporary events or figures as if they took place in the ancient past, the contemporarization is the dominant mode. Either choice, nonetheless, introduces an anachronistic framework to his work that undermines the character of the Bible as a sacred or a historical text, either way that you relate to the Bible. But it underscores its mnemonic role as a symbolic text. And as I try to show in my analysis, it's this innovative approach, the anachronistic approach, that also is the source of humor that juxtaposes our knowledge of the narrative, the biblical narrative, with his interpretation that is inappropriate, quote unquote, and therefore it's funny. The novelty of Shelef's work is the deliberate secularist agenda and the satirical approach. He retells the biblical stories by replacing the Bible with the biblical Hebrew with contemporary colloquial Hebrew. For instance, he uses Israeli political terms telling biblical stories like the deputy minister or the opposition, oppositia. Or he uses contemporary religious and military expressions, the chief rabbi, or military summon, savgius. So these things that are totally out of place there, he just interweaves them into the text. He also uses foreign words that were adapted into Israeli Hebrew, like protectia. In his chapter on the book of Job, Shelef reverts to a more radical, okay, so I'm giving some examples of light uses of this approach, which I didn't have time to explore, so I decided to go directly to a more heavy duty text among the Shelef text here in this talk. And I'm moving to his work on, to his reinterpretation of the book of Job. Shelef reverts to a more radical use of contemporarization, referring to God as a researcher who violates the ethical standards of studying human subjects, noting God's tendency to be carried away by excessive scientific zeal. And the example that he gives to that is Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, that totally violates the scientific rules of studying human subjects. Shelef also criticizes God's reply to Job as, I quote, a communication failure, keshel hasbarati. And he recommends to the old, and I quote, I recommend to the Almighty that next time he finds better speech writers. He describes the biblical episode relating to Korach and the people who challenge Moses' leadership and are punished when the earth opens up and swallows them by referring to it as the burial of the opposition, and shifting it to the contemporary context of the Israeli Knesset as he comments wryly. Clearly, democracy was not in vogue in those days. Well, we don't know how democracy is to be celebrated now, but we didn't get to the extreme case of the swallowing of the opposition, literally, as the Bible does. I know that the time is short and I won't expand on other examples, but you got the gist of Shelef's work. What I just want to comment as a conclusion of that what was celebrated as so innovative in 1985 does not look as innovative for the perspective of today, because in spite of the very often stated kind of a complaint about the decline of the Bible and that it has disappeared, it has not disappeared in Israeli culture in all kind of subversive ways. And I do not mean about the official study of the Bible, and I do not even mean about its embracement as the sacred taste in Orthodox and Haredi circles. I'm actually interested in the secular culture or the traditional to see how it is used. And what we see in Israeli culture, and that's what I hope to present when I finish this work, is the different ways that the Bible is still playing a role, sometimes as a counter narrative, sometimes as a subversive narrative, sometimes for totally inappropriate purposes when taken from a religious perspective, but they are still part of what happens in Israel and part of Israeli culture. So that's maybe for a future conference and a future celebration of Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now the response to all these stimulating talks and tributes to you. Yeah. You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. First and foremost, I want to thank Yael for her extraordinary service as president of this association and congratulate her on having handed the torch over to someone else. Now, I also want to congratulate the organizers and participants in this 3-day conference, which was a very impressive achievement under obviously very challenging circumstances. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank the editors and contributors to this volume, which is by far the most moving honor that I have received in my very lengthy academic career. And I just can't even express in words how much it means to me. Because of the limitation of time primarily, I am going to limit my remarks to even less than obviously the epilogue of the book, to which these wonderful scholars have contributed their chapters. I do want to mention only one personal note. Some of you who know me well know that serendipity is one of my favorite terms. And how I ever got into the study of Israel, and particularly from a political anthropological perspective, is incredibly a function of serendipity, which is too long to go into, but just say that in both my graduate programs, my PhDs at both UCLA and Manchester, I studied more courses on Africa and no courses, even as an undergraduate or graduate students, on Israel, because none were offered at the time. And I really don't have time to work that theme out, other than to say that there was the most wonderful confluence of accidents that prevented me from studying Africa and brought me to devote my whole professional career to the study of Israel. Not exclusively, but primarily. Excuse me. I see the contributions in three kind of topic areas: conflict and peace, ethnicity, identity, challenges to democracy, and finally, national memory, literature, and satire. And because of compressing time limits, I want to try to just simply refer to articles primarily in this book, which is co-authored with my colleague Jan Kubik. It's called Anthropology and Political Science, A Convergent Approach. I began my study of conflict and research on a peace, possibilities for peace, as a fulfillment of my reserve duty in the Israel Defense Force in the Office of Strategic Planning. Obviously, I can't refer to that. I've never published any of that research, but it was very important spade work for much of the things that I was eventually got into in terms of formal research. Just to note that, in fact, unlike many of my colleagues in the unit, I was not involved with the planning of war, but planning for peace. And that was an incredibly influential, a big influence on my career as a scholar as well. Looking at Yossi, I mean, the single article that I would refer to that's a chapter in this book, it's actually chapter 7, is called Camp David Rashomon, which looks at the Camp David process and the negotiations in Taba, which of course Yossi was instrumental in terms of the different narratives of all participants in the process, that is Israeli and Palestinian delegations, and among the mediators themselves. And Yael and I interviewed a significant number of all of these different categories, she for her own research and I for mine. And it taught me something that I think is very important in trying to understand the complexity of peace negotiations, And it's slightly different than Yossi's take on it, because Yossi found that the excessive trust, in the way he explained it brilliantly, was an obstacle. But what I was finding is quite the opposite. The amount of distrust, not only between the Israeli and Palestinian delegations, but within them, among participants in each team where there was a lot of distrust and friction, was a major obstacle to the successful even conclusion of an agreement, much less implementation of one. I've done a lot of work on Israeli collective identity, and the chapter that I would refer anybody interested in is chapter 5 of this book, which is called The Politics of Collective Identity, Contested Israeli Nationalisms in the Plural. A couple of the presentations I've heard in this conference particularly have tended to resort to what I consider a kind of archaic approach, almost I would say national cultural approach, or generalizing about not just Israeli and Palestinian identity or culture and so forth, without understanding the essential contextuality of culture and the contested nature of culture. And I have tried in various publications to refine a conceptual approach, which I hope is useful, although I have never seen it cited, so I doubt that it is that useful, at least for people. But it tries to show how the roles of time and place and religiosity, among other, and sense of security, personal and collective security, provide a conceptual way to understand the differences between the types of collective identity, the more liberal, the less liberal, and the completely illiberal types of collective identity that are not only were present during the time that I did this research, but continue to be, I think, present in the current Israeli scene. The outlier on this, and Joel was kind enough to mention my book on Frontier Town, and it's certainly, and as has Yael, which kind of is remarkable because again, that was written so long ago, it was essentially my doctoral dissertation, but it is in a sense also a study in which conflict is central to understanding the constitution of a sense of collectivity, a common space, as Joel framed it so well, and how, in a way, the professionalization and bureaucratization of state-wide institutions, primarily political parties, but also government ministries, completely reshaped the dynamics of these internal groups. Yael Zerubavel mentioned that satire was central to her work and has been central to some of my analyses. I love political satire, always have. And the case study that resonates with her work for me is a state funeral sponsored by the government of Menachem Begin for the burial of the bones of Shimon Bar Kokhba and his followers. And the protest of peace now, people wearing Roman togas and carrying spears and carrying signs, you're making a you're making a mockery of our history. And that whole ritualization of protest in a satirical way seemed to resonate to me with Yael's chapter in this book. But it also provided a format for contestation between those who bought into Begin's argument, and those, which was certainly the majority of intellectuals, scholars, and so forth, who saw that as a preposterous distortion of history. And this spread out into, there were conferences held at the Van Leer Institute on this subject. And it, again, provided me a way of understanding that there are deep, deep divisions in Israeli society and polity, but at least for the Jewish participants, the Jewish Israeli participants in this contestation, there was a common language that is not only literally Hebrew, but figuratively, this was still within what I think we could broadly define as the Zionist discourse. I think that is certainly less true today than it was then. The other thing that Yael Zerubavel was kind enough to mention is my work on the spy novels of John le Carré. And I've entitled it Balancing Ethics and Politics. And for me, I found that looking at fiction, and I see my son-in-law Eric here, who's a professor of literature, looking at fictions allows us as scholars to get into and understand important things that we can't, I as a political scientist or an anthropologist don't have access to. And certainly the world of espionage is something that we clearly, most of us don't have access to. But it deals with issues that are, I think, critical, central to understanding democracies. Much of his early work focused on the Cold War, of course. But his book, The Little Drummer Girl, was a dramatic representation of how the Israeli Mossad recruited an English actress in order to infiltrate a network of Palestinian terrorists who were operating against Israelis and Jews in Europe at the time. And what I was struck by, as I always was with le Carré's work, his prescience in understanding and being able to predict events. Because essentially this book was published before the 1982 Israeli war in Lebanon, and yet he talks about it as if it had happened when it was on the cusp of going to happen. And so there are many, many, many different kinds of influences that have informed my approach. And I again want to return to thanking my colleagues for honoring me with this wonderful, wonderful book and this plenary session, or mini-plenary session, let me correct myself. And I sincerely hope that we will be able to continue our dialogues. You can't know, Eric, what's the multiple dialogue? Anyway, you know what I mean. I hope we will be able to continue the conversation, as it were, in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone, and thanks for staying, an extra half hour, especially those of you in Israel where it's very late at the end of a 3-day conference. So this, I think this speaks to how highly everyone thinks of you, Daddy, and thanks for all of you who stuck around so long as well. I think we had great participation. So thank you everyone. And enjoy the summer, and hopefully some of the optimistic points some of you made will come to pass. So,
Alavai.
Yeah, alavai. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for organizing it. And Mazel Tov for ending the presidency.